Okay.
I am Willie Evans, Willie Hammondtree Evans, and I was born on a farm up the railroad from the main place to Gina, and I lived there till I was about 10 years old. And I said that Thelma was a Hammondtree, but we never did know that we were related, whether we were or not. So many Hammondtrees in Greenback then. But I found out at the museum that some of them didn't know there was a place that was called Gina. We don't have any signs down there to mark it off, but to me it's always been Gina down there because I played 10 years, and then I graduated to Greenback with about 7 girls that we took over Greenback. But anyhow, we had a good time. And I can remember when there were two tracks that went down through the main part of Gina, and we had a depot agent. And Thelma may be going to tell this too, so I'm going to let her tell what she wants to about it, but there was one thing she said she wasn't going to tell. My Uncle Bose Hammondtree, I guess his name was Ambrose, but he was my grandfather's brother, and Gladys Henry and Henry Hammondtree and them's father. And he had the grist mill down there where the co-op is. For years, I don't have anybody to ask now how many years, but about all I remembered. But he would fuss about people going across that railroad track and not stopping because we didn't have one of those things to say it was a railroad track. And he would sit down there in his straight back chair, and he'd think about how they'd just go across that railroad, and that's where he got killed. He went across it and got hit with a train.
Wow.
And I remember very well, I think I was in high school at that time. Of course, I went to Greenback High School. And I married one of the 8 Evans boys, and I was married almost 70 years to him when he passed away 4 years ago. And we had a great life. He was a minister in years, and he pastored 9 churches in the July Association, and I was fortunate to have a good husband. And I've always appreciated Gina, and I remember the Uncle Charlie and Aunt Julia's store down there. And so I'll let Thelma talk about how she lived down there. But Mr. Disney, Mr. A.L. Aubrey Disney, was depot agent down there one time. And I remember before they took the tracks up, how the mail would come from Knoxville, and at 9:15 in the morning, drop the mail off there in Greenback, and then go on to Etowah, and turn around down there and come back about 4 o'clock and pick up the mail, take it to Knoxville. It wasn't delivered by truck then. So anyway, there was also a grocery store in Gina for years. My Uncle Charlie Thompson, he married my mother's sister, Aunt Julia, which was Ella Mae Phipps's mother. And I don't know how many years that he had it down there, and it had a living quarters in the back, but they raised their 2 daughters, Ella Mae Phipps and Edgar Thompson, there in that store. And me and my husband and my sister and her husband decided we wanted to run the grocery store, but we didn't like to put a little bit at it. But Thelma stayed all night with me down there one night. My husband was gone hunting. But anyway, where the granary bins are is where Uncle Charlie had the store. And then the section crew was along that road. And then hers was up on the hill on that side. But anyway, that was when I can remember 2 tracks, railroad tracks, elemental trail tracks, coming down. And I lived in the farm, as you can see when you get to the railroad crossing, the White House and the Red Barn, about a mile up there, was where I was born 93 years ago. But Uncle Charlie, when he sold that store and he bought some land over off Craig's Chapel, But he had a bushel basket full of pennies. I remember that. A bushel basket full of pennies. But I can remember a lot of those things that happened down there. But anyway, it was a little, and I found out in the museum that they didn't know anything about it, Gina. That wasn't, I said, well, there's history down there. And Mr. Disney, Aubrey Disney, and he lived in that big house up there on the hill. But his son married my sister, the Disneys. But he went from there to Wanor, then to Englewood, and then he went to La Follette with the L&N, and they gave him a gold watch for 50 years with L&N.
Okay. What do you remember about school?
Well, I had a good time.
That's good. That's good.
No, it was a great experience, and I always did take it serious. I remember one teacher especially was Irma Griffiths in my 5th and 6th grade, and she was such a down-to-earth person, and I think she must have made an impact on everybody in that class, because I think that we all acted better. But I remember that she would take a period off, and this just come to me, and she would read us out of a book. Well, so many chapters, you know, and we'd look forward to the next day for her to read us some more out of that book. Well, somebody took her a book that wasn't too nice, and she said, oh, I'll have to read them before I start on them. I remember it was in there, I think it was the 6th grade, and she was really a good teacher. But we had a good time in there. And then another thing, that was when my husband came to Greenback from the North Dam. When they built the dam, they had to relocate, and they came to Greenback. So that's the year I remember the most, because he was in my life.
Bill, you told me about him picking you up on the streets.
Oh, let me tell you this. There used to be the Merchants and Farmers Bank out here. Well, a long time after he went to the Navy, and he'd asked me for 3 days, or 2 days before that, and I hadn't turned him down. Well, me and another a girl, was walking along the street out there where the old Merchants and Farmers Bank was in Greenback at that time. And I didn't even know he was home from the Navy. He got home the day before, and he turned in there real quick like and asked me if I would go to a movie that night. And I said, well, yes. And that was it to start our 70 years. But anyway, he would jokingly tell he'd pick me up off the street. I said, you better not tell that to nobody. That don't know
That wouldn't sound so good.
He said, well, I did.
That's good.
But anyway, my immediate family, I was thinking through that. I'm the only one left well, we had a baby brother to die, but I had another brother that was the postmaster out here in the new post office, the first new post office master. And then I had three sisters, well, 4 of us girls. Johnny Myers, did you know her? She was a politician, and I allowed everybody in Loudoun County knew. Johnny Myers, and then Mildred Disney, and his daddy was the depot agent in Gina at one time, and then Shirley Bell, married Fred Bell. And I was sitting here looking at those cabinets. Did he make them?
I think so.
I think my brother-in-law, he's gone.
He had a business called Bellcraft here.
Bellcraft, he was a cabinet maker.
He made that big cross that's in the Presbyterian Church.
Well, we've got one in our church.
Yeah, too. Yeah, he made those, I think, for a lot of the churches.
Shepherd. Well, he was gone, but I told Steve about the one in Pine Grove Church that it made, and Rex brought us one for our new place of worship.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and anyway, but I remember a lot about Gina. Do you not remember both tracks going up through the main part of Gina? Mm-hmm. There was 2 tracks, not that one coming from Greenback. I'm talking about 2 tracks. You don't remember that? Because I crawled in under both of them and then beside I lived in that farm about a mile up the road from the Gina Crossing down there, you can see it, and that was where Daddy and Grandpa Hamilton sold it to Harley Myers before him and my oldest sister married, and he bought the farm. Then Daddy built a couple of houses over toward 411. But anyway, I had a good life, had a good upbringing, and we had, now I'm the only one left of the whole family, and it's kind of sad.
Well, better you're the chosen
We
one.
used to have, fish fries, and Daddy loved to go to Florida deep sea fishing, and he would bring back a cooler full of fish. We all gathered up there and fished and stuff like that.
What jobs did you have?
I really graduated, I went 12 years, of course, at Greenback and graduated, and I was more a stay-at-home mother, but when the boys got in school, when they were able to, we lived right close to the school. I worked when I was about 16 or 17, I worked at the Greenback drugstore. And then I worked at the A&B store in Greenback, and then I worked for Mr. King at the King's dry goods and grocery store there in Greenback. But I never did venture out of Greenback much. But I got a lot of funny things to tell about it. The co-op was out there in Greenback, and they rode their horses, and everybody here knows Mr. Johnson. You know Jay Johnson. Did you know Jay Johnson? Anyway, he would tie his horse out there at the co-op, and this come and whittle and stay all day. Well, Mr. King's store, was in view of it. Well, Doc Archer got to be the deputy, or whatever you want to call it, in Greenback. Doc Archer did. Well, just to play a joke, he went out there and put a no parking ticket. and they almost had a fight over that. That was grown men, and it was funny. But I learned a lot of stuff like that.
I bet.
Saturday was a real busy time for us because everybody came out of the knobs and everywhere to do their grocery shopping. At the A&B store and the drugstore and Mr. King's dry goods, he sold one of the girls that I know now. She said those saddle Oxfords. She said her daddy would get a charge account with Mr. King, and they'd buy their groceries all year. And then when he sold his tobacco, he was an honest, good person. He'd come up there and pay his whole bill. And she said later, she wished he would get in some kind of shoes besides those saddle Oxfords. She got so tired of wearing them. So it was just, I got an education that way.
There you go.
No, I got an education at home. I was glad to be a mother
Sure.
and a housekeeper and probably a guest in the church work. I really enjoyed all the places we got to worship.
All those are gratifying.
It was great. And I went to Eastern Star. I went through all of it. I was worthy matron, associate matron, and all the stars. I went through all of Eastern Star. And it was over that old white building out there next to the drugstore. At that time, they're not there now. They're still away, but that's where we had the Eastern Star.
I'd like you to tell me about your memories of stores and where your family shopped in this area. Miss Bill?
Well, when we, I guess, moved over on the highway to that area next to the telephone company, we did a lot of shopping there in Gina at my Uncle Charlie Thompson's store that I said he was there for years and years and years. You could get all the staples and stuff there. And then into Greenback was the A&B store. I worked in it, and Sam King's store, it was a dry goods and a grocery store. He carried most everything in that line. And I worked in there for him for about 3 or 4 years after my boys started to school. And then we started to go into Maryville, you know, later on. When I remember when I first started learning to drive, I remember that. And I'd go up there to the fruit markets and Winn-Dixie's and all that at Maryville. And that was about. And then we raised down there on the farm. My grandmother Hammondtree lived with us, and she could just make a meal. She'd just wring a chicken's neck and fry it right then. And you know, we had our meats and our eggs and our butter and milk and all that down there on the farm. And so that in earlier years when I lived there, about 10 years, I guess, of my life. But I remember that we just went to Uncle Charlie's store down in Gina and got the flour and meal and lard. And if we needed, we usually raised the cattle or the hogs and made our own. I've seen this big old black kettle with rendering out the lard, you know, and strain it and put it in a clean 5-gallon bucket, and that's what we used all from year to year to make our bread and stuff with and cook with.
So you grew up on a farm then?
I grew up in the early times when we did like that. Yeah, but nowadays, this generation don't know how to make a meal unless they go to the store. We had sweet potatoes, Irish potatoes, and all kinds of fruits and vegetables. We had a little behind that Johnny, where I grew up down there, swimming pool there now, but we had an orchard. And I've seen my grandmother Hammondtree. She had wore an apron. She did most of the cooking, and Mama did most of the outside work when we all lived together up there one time before they passed away. And my daddy was watching me cook up here in the house one day. I didn't know he was watching me, but he said, "Bill, you just remind me of Mama." Because they said, and now she could cook a meal out of nothing. I mean, she knew how to manage and to cook. And we had plenty to eat. And have a pharmacy in the drugstore at that time. That's why it was called the drugstore. And I worked during that time when I was a junior and senior in when I was in junior, sophomore in high school in that drugstore. And we made our own hamburger patties and froze them. And then Mr. Cook's wife lived out there at the light at that circle, and she made the best chili. I've got her recipe.
They're still using it over at the country corner.
People come and
Oh, yeah.
I gave it to the one that owns the diner now. I gave her a recipe because Fred gave me the recipe.
Yeah.
And I remember people would come from Maryville and Vonore and Lenore City to get hot dogs, and sometimes we'd make a dozen at a time, and you know, they'd just buy a whole bunch to take home with them. And so, but anyway, I remember those sections of now my uncle and aunt, the Besses, Uncle John Bess, he owned that end one for 50 years, the desk and the stools in the museum, and he owned it for 50 years there on the end. And in between there somewhere where the McCalls owned hardwares and all, there was what they called a packing house. And my grandfather Long instead of a red wagon, he had a horse and buggy that he went down through the knobs of selling stuff, and he'd bring back eggs and butter and everything to the pack and come around to the back of where the museum is, to the packing house and swap it for money, and you know, and then they would do the way we sell it and all. And Mr. Bob Cook that owned the drugstore, he was kind of a little feisty man, and my mama's told me many a time, said he pinched her on the bottom and she threw a pound of butter at him. You can believe that if you want to. He deserved it. But those stories, and A&B stores stood for Alexander and Brooks. And
Hazel.
yeah. She was the sister-in-law to Roy.
Yeah, a lot of our friends ask
One
us.
that has the corner, Buzz Market over there on the corner, that's their Roy Brooks' son, grandson.
So that's
He'd
from
be
the Brooks.
old Roy's
of that.
grandson.
Yeah, he'd be his old grandson, and talking about it getting his hand, I've always heard it was a firecracker caused it was his hand.
Yeah.
What did you do for fun?
Well, I graduated from over on the highway to Greenback in that area. If anything, there were 7 of us girls. We always joke about the 7 girls. And I was over there by Mary Ruth Keys, and we would come to Greenback if there was going to be anything going on in the little town of Greenback, school or whatever. We were always together, us 7 girls. It was June Hammontree and Carol Melton, Carolyn Peck, and May and Mary Ruth, and Sue Ann Swaney, and anyway, there were 7 of us. And we did mischievous things I was talking about. I said, well, we really didn't do any tearing up or anything in Halloween, but we'd gather up leaves and fill up people's porch with leaves and just do, little stuff like that. And out here, let's see where we at. Down here, did you remember Hattie and Timer Alexander lived in? They had so much grown up over it you couldn't see the little shack they lived in hardly. Yeah. But we would let them get their lights all on, and then we'd throw grapples on the roof. And they'd turn all the lights on in the house, and us girls would be out there, except no boys. But the boys would do other things. Danny was telling one episode that they did, and the Marley boys was the ringleaders just about it, but my 2 chimed in. I was down at the beauty shop at Bonner the other day getting my hair done, and she said, do you know Mark Barley? And I said, yeah. She said, well, he was down here the other day with Dwayne Birchfield, your mayor, and said, I've never heard the like of story they was telling about Greenback. I said, my 2 boys was in on it because they wrote you remember how they got that boxcar from Meta started, come down the railroad, and they'd take turns when you got to a railroad, a road crossing, some would get off and they'd stop the traffic, get them through, and they'd go all the way to Gina on them. And one of them, Jeff, I think it's Jeff, but that was this nicest boy that ever come to my house, and I had bukus of boys. I mean, they're fine boys. Yeah, my base would be full of boys playing. If it was snowing and everything, I was drying clothes. They'd go out and sled and come in with wet clothes on. They'd take all they could off and put it in the dryer and make them hot chocolate. Joe Hall told me that I could make the best hot chocolate of anybody in Greenback. I'd go through gallons of milk for them. They'd be down in the basement playing. They had it set up down there that we had a living room down there, and they had a ping pong table and everything. Those were good days.
Where did your greatest influence come from, and why? Were they that influence on your life? Who influenced you the most in your life?
I guess my immediate family, I'd say, had more influence. But outside of my immediate family, I guess my Aunt Julia Thompson. That was the one that owned the store. She was Mama's sister. She had a big influence on me when I was a child, growing up in that area. And then after I got into...
How did she have an influence on you?
Well, I know that our house burned. I always stood by that old fashion cupboard. My grandmother Hammontree, she would cook the meal, and Mama would go out and milk and get the chickens in, and then Dad would come in from the sawmill. That's before he went to Alcoa to work. He had a sawmill. And she would give me a little bit of dough to make me a biscuit. Where she cut them out, she'd let me have. Well, Aunt Julia, I know these little things like that. I spent the night at their house burnt with Aunt Julia and them down at the store at Gina. And as I said, I was 3 years old. Well, later in years, she'd always tell me about when she started to put me in bed, I had my hand like that. And she opened it up, and I had that dough still in my hand. And she was just such a, clean and calm person, and she would never I don't think ever tell you anything wrong. I had the idea of that. And I mean, think she would. And to her knowledge, she was really Mama's sister and my favorite aunt at that time.
What are you the most proud of in your life? That's a better way to put it.
My faith in God and the experiences that I've had in the churches that I have followed my husband live, and my 70-year marriage to him and my family is the legacy that I wouldn't care to leave behind.
I'll ask you if there's any other stories or anything else you'd like to say.
The co-op, you know where
Yeah.
the co-op was. Well, the men would meet out there. When I worked at Mr. King's store, I could see straight through there. Well, you know, Duck Archer then took over as a deputy, you know, constable or whatever he was. He said I didn't stop at that stop sign to go into work one morning. But anyway, the men would stop out there and they'd tie up their horses and everything and whittle and tell stories and everything for hours, and you could see them out there. Well, one day, Doc Archer thought it'd be funny to put a illegal parking sign on the horse. He likes to call us the Fives. The man didn't take it as a joke. And now we got so tickled about that. And then when I worked at Mr. King's store, like you said, he had a dry goods store. And one poor boy, I did feel sorry for him, but after he left, he took a pair of the new shoes and put his old ones in the box.
That's when they had his name on the old shoes and they found him out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had his name and address.
Yeah.